All right, guys, how are you doing? Good, I'm glad to hear it. Just kidding. So, this is just a little bit of a different way for us to do a star review. I know a lot of you don't want to have to read through all those mountains of notes that we've gotten to and been through over and over and over again. But if you have a little bit of time, of course, on your own, and you've got access to playing some sort of an MP4, this is a good, fun way to try to review everything in a pretty quick fashion. So I figured to start off our year review for our star, we're going to start where we began, which was the Gilded Age. Now, it's the very first thing we talked about this year, so we're going to be starting right about the time around 1870 up to about 1900. Now, the guy that you see right here that we've talked about before, Samuel Clemens, is the guy that referred to America as being in its Gilded Age. Again, why do we refer to it as the Gilded Age? Because it was pretty simple. Because America looked really awesome from the outside. We had a lot of wealth. People were becoming richer in the United States than most people had accumulated throughout history. We had mass manufacturing happening faster, with products being made to places throughout the entire world. We were going to be the #1 producer of goods throughout the world. We had just finished connecting the Transcontinental Railroad from East Coast to West Coast. We had pretty well just achieved manifest destiny. Things were good. They were optimistic. We were secure. But when you looked at America on the inside, well, it was a little bit bad. We had poverty. We had people being taken advantage of in the workplace. Life for minorities still was not good, especially for the African Americans in the South. There was a lot of political corruption. There was a lot of unsafe conditions in the United States, and there was a lot of difference in wealth between the rich and the poor. So America looked great on the outside, but underneath, not so good. So let's look a little bit at the Gilded Age. And if we're going to start with the Gilded Age, we got to start talking a little bit about the Old West. And no, we're not going to get into the cowboys and Indians thing, yeehaw. We're actually going to begin with what really helped to solidify the West, and that is going to be the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. Yes, remember Cornelius Vanderbilt is going to be the primary builders of this railroad. And of course, being out there, Vanderbilt is going to make a tremendous amount of money off of this. Now, don't forget and don't underestimate the importance of the Transcontinental Railroad. I mean, once this thing is built, we now have people in one side of the country finally able to sell to products in another part of the United States they never dreamed of before. That's a crud load of new customers for you. It's new markets to expose your products to. Farmers can get their crops from point A to point B so much faster. Settlers, miners, salespeople can travel from part A to part B in one part of the country to the other so much faster than they could before. This speeds up migration of the United States. You got to look at the Transcontinental Railroad basically as being the main blood artery for the center part and the heart of the United States. Do not ever underestimate the influence and the importance of the Transcontinental Railroad. And of course, they're going to meet when the two railroad companies finally meet. They're going to meet right there at Promontory Point in Utah. And basically, once this connection happens, we can pretty well say manifest destiny is done. We have literally connected the United States from East Coast to West Coast. But this could not have been done without the tremendous amount of labor. And of course, the two groups of individuals that are mostly credited, although it was all kinds, but seem to be getting the most amount of credit when it comes to manufacturing the railroad, of course, are going to be the Irish and the Chinese. Now, the Irish and Chinese both were pretty well going to be discriminated against. People were not thrilled about the Irish because of their Catholicism and some reputations that they had back in Ireland. And of course, the Chinese, being from Asia, looking different, sounding different, with different customs, well, there's going to be a lot of discrimination against them as well, eventually leading us to pass a law that would actually exclude the Chinese from the United States for quite a while. Now, when we're talking about actually occupying the center part of the United States, moving out west of the Mississippi, we have to credit the Homestead Act. Now, in 1862, the government is going to pass this law that basically says, look, we have got a crud load of land available for settlement. Now, west of the Mississippi, it was open and vast. It was open for new migration out there. We have to begin colonizing the rest of the United States. And, well, for $10, we're going to be able to give you 160 acres of land, and you're going to get the deed to it after 5 years. Why 5 years? Don't forget, well, you had to do something with it. You couldn't just go out there, break it up, and sell it. No, you had to do something with it. Otherwise, nothing was getting accomplished. Well, this is going to lead to tens of thousands of individuals working their way out to the center part of the United States, into the Great Plains, and even further west into the Rockies and west of the Rockies, and begin settlement. However, we know settlement life was very, very difficult. Of course, out on the Great Plains, there's very little rain, so basically you had to bury your seeds deep into the ground, called dry farming. The ground was incredibly hard, like a brick almost, so you invent the sod buster, the little iron plow, to help break it up. And of course, you use your environment around you to actually go ahead and begin building your materials. There wasn't a whole lot of wood, so basically everything had to be built out of sod, the top 6 inches to a foot of the top ground out there in the Great Plains. Life was difficult, but people still made it. However, we know there will be a problem as people move out there because, well, it's not like there weren't any people out there to begin with. There were a lot of really angry Native Americans who had been forced out westward, forced into subjugation since even before Andrew Jackson moved them out there. And they were becoming very hostile to the American government and the attempts to begin to settle out there. So we're going to see a lot of conflicts between the railroads, the government, and the settlers out on the center of the Great Plains. And of course, this will lead to a number of pretty violent conflicts. Of course, one being the Battle of Little Bighorn, in which poor little General Custer decides to make a little mistake. And I believe some of his last words were, "Dang, that's a lot of Indians." And that was it. But of course, I guess one of the biggest or most significant Indian conflicts that's going to take place is going to be the massacre at Wounded Knee. And of course, the massacre at Wounded Knee will eventually be tragic enough for the Native Americans that eventually they're not going to have a choice but to go on to the reservation system. But before we do that, we figured maybe one of the better ways to get them to stay on a reservation is to end their nomadic way of life, and the way to do that would be the elimination of the buffalo. Now, the buffalo will wind up moving from anywhere from 40 million to 60 million buffalo down to almost pure extinction for a number of reasons. One of, obviously, of course, we wanted to thin out the herds in an attempt to try to eliminate the food supply for the Native Americans. 2, we had to feed our railroad workers somehow, and of course, buffalo was going to be the easiest way to do that. Also, you got to start talking about the desire for buffalo hides, which becomes a big fashion fad in a lot of homes in Europe, as well as in the eastern part of the cities of the United States. You get a buffalo hide, it's a piece of the Wild West that you can actually have in your home, and people wanted it. But there was also quite a few diseases that they would be subjected to as cattle began moving into free range and free graze out in the middle of the grasslands of the United States. Because we were doing a lot of free range drives out there, and those long cattle drives. And some of the diseases that would migrate out of the cattle would eventually get into the buffalo, and that would actually also contribute to the diminishing of the herds. Now, of course, we know the long drives and the cattle drives eventually come to the end with the advent of barbed wire, the devil's rope. Yeah, when barbed wire comes in, you can't free range your cattle anymore. You got to hem them up. Well, so much for grazing, so much for the long cattle drives, and so much for the buffalo. The West begins to change. Now, once the Native Americans had pretty well been subjugated through elimination of their food sources, as well as the Indian conflicts, we're going to be placing them on the reservation systems. Now, a lot of times we might see on Star Exam maybe a map that might indicate some areas, either in Oklahoma, New Mexico, Arizona, up into Montana, the Dakotas, and in those areas in there, and you should kind of get a general idea. These are not areas that you would associate with, of course, Japanese internment, but of course, the Native American reservations. I mean, pretty much how Oklahoma starts. Now, once we get them on the reservations, what happens? Well, we're going to try to Americanize them. Well, in other words, we're going to try to teach them English. We're going to try to teach them to become sedentary, no longer be nomadic. Learn to farm, learn to stay here, learn good American ways, become patriotic, learn some American schooling. But the Dawes Act is going to be an absolute failure. It is going to be resisted by many Native American tribes. They were not wanting to abandon their way of life they had known for thousands of years. So, up until even today, life on the reservations for a lot of Native Americans is going to be still one of struggle. Although there will be a Native American, sort of a civil rights movement that'll pick up again in the late 60s and 70s, which we'll talk about later on, the civil rights movement. Now, back in the cities, this is where we need to start looking at how America really begins to assert itself in the world. And that's going to be the Industrial Revolution. Obviously, it's the building of our industries. We are moving away from being a country that does primarily farming and agriculture to one that does manufacturing. But with mass manufacturing comes the end of skilled little laborers like the cobbler, the shoemaker, like those that made specialized clothes or made specialized utilities. Now everything can be mass produced, but it's a dependable job. You didn't have to worry about starving to death in general. Life was tough, labor was hard, but it was guaranteed. Well, who is it that's going to be responsible for operating and creating a lot of these massive industrialized entities? Well, we're going to start talking about a group called our robber barons, also called captains of industry, but we'll get into that later. Now, we're going to be talking about people like, of course, Cornelius Vanderbilt, who would build the railroads, as well as has a big, beautiful house, the Biltmore. We're going to be talking about Mr. Andrew Carnegie, the ornery little Scotsman there, that comes up with the Bessemer process, to cheap, fast, easy way to make strong steel, which allows for the development of our cities to actually go upward instead of outward. And of course, the monopoly trust man, Mr. John D. Rockefeller and his Standard Oil Company, who will become an incredibly wealthy and powerful individual. And then finally, within banking, we have Mr. J.P. Morgan. J.P. Morgan Chase, there you go, that's what we're talking about. Now, how do these individuals get this way? Well, there's a couple reasons. One, remember we have the free enterprise system in the United States at the time, which basically meant you use your talents and skills and your ability to make as much as you can, run your business how you want, with low taxation, and use whatever talents that you had to achieve as much as you can. That was the idea of the free enterprise system. You're free to run your business as you want and keep as much of the profit as you want, because this desire and seeking a profit tends to make things better. That's why in the United States we had this idea of laissez-faire. The government stayed out of your business when it came to economics in your business. Let the people do as they may, laissez-faire basically says. Run your business how you want. Treat your workers how you want, pretty much within reason, and pay them however you want, because ultimately business was good for America. Now, of course, these individuals, once they began building these large industries, hated competition. More competition means less revenue and profit for them. So they began developing these monopolies or trusts. These entities that own all or control an entire market of one thing or another. Standard Oil would do its best to control all the oil industry and then eventually other parts of the energy industry, eliminating all competition. Vanderbilt was very well known for buying out any little small railroad that wanted to come in, or undercutting his prices so much the small railroad couldn't stay in business. But we know whenever monopolies or trusts forms, that eliminates competition. That means really high prices and a lot of influence. We've seen this particular cartoon a lot of times. Standard Oil, a lot of times when it comes to trust, is always pictured as like this octopus or sort of leviathan monster that has its tentacles in pretty much every part of American society, and it's dangerous. Now, we know later on this all gets undone with the Sherman Antitrust Act, or at least early on in the Clayton Antitrust Act, but we'll get into that later. So let's talk a little bit about Carnegie. Remember, Carnegie was incredibly important because of his Bessemer process with steel. Now, the most important part of Carnegie's Bessemer process is going to be that it allows cheap steel, which means our cities that have become overly stretched in distance, now we can actually compensate for that by building up. This completely changes how cities are going to be structured. How many more people can actually live in the cities now? How many more businesses can actually operate in a city as we go up? This changes the actual landscape of America. You cannot underestimate it, and Carnegie's going to be responsible for most of this. Now, when we talked about these robber barons, the debate was always going